Welcome to James Lynden, Innovation Lead with an expertise in ethics. James is joining us as part of our MBA Product Leadership series. And today we're going to be talking about something that maybe is a little bit outside of what we would generally consider product leadership, but something that I believe, and I know James believes, is a core part of product, and that is product ethics. So James, there's a sort of rising awareness of ethics in tech companies starting to see unintended consequences of their work. Maybe let's start with the simple thing. Why does ethics matter?
Hello again, Henry. So thank you for having me. So I think that why did ethics matter? I think that in this context of product leadership, which is what this conversation is about, I think you just cannot call yourself a product leader if you're not doing ethics. I think that ethics is an intrinsic part of leadership. And if you're not doing ethics, not thinking ethics, if you don't have that quality of thinking, then it's a kind of Donald Trump flavor of leadership. And I don't think you need to justify ethics in that way. Why should ethics matters? Ethics just matters intrinsically as a human being on this planet. That's what ethics is. Yeah. And why for a product leader does ethics matter? I think so. One, there is an increasing awareness in society, as you just mentioned, around ethics. I think people are increasingly becoming aware of the impact of technology on their lives. And this is, I think, all types of products, but let's keep this on technology products as a product manager type task. And I think, with that increasing awareness in society of the impact of technology products, product teams are becoming increasingly aware of the need to engage in ethics. Yet, so few product teams do ethics explicitly. I've worked with lots of different product teams in my life and kind of been on several product teams, and I think ethics has never really been an explicit aspect in the decision-making framework. So that's why I think this conversation matters. Not why I think ethics matters, but why I think this conversation matters is because I think there's just a gap between the increasing awareness of ethics around PMs, also for designers and for technologists and people in product teams in general. But then a kind of lack of incentives, a lack of frameworks, a lack of skills to actually bring ethics into product strategy decisions.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well. I don't know if you've thought about this, but the one thing that I always think about when it comes to ethics is with tech companies and particularly high growth, there's such an excitement around it. It's cool, like look how many new users we're getting, etc. That I think it is very easy to get caught up in that and to not, let's take someone that we would consider an inherently good person who, with friends and family is probably extremely ethical, empathetic, kind. Yeah, in these moments, outside of this as well, moments of stress, moments of excitement, people forget to ask themselves the right questions. I don't know if that's something you've observed.
I think that piece around the right questions is a really good point, because we have these kind of mental models in our heads of what questions we should be asking when we're doing product strategy. So is it desirable to the user? Is it feasible for the technology? Is it viable to the business? And I think what's missing is that just kind of that go-to question is it integral? Does it have integrity for the ethics? And you're right. It's very easy to accidentally leave your ethics at the door, and have that kind of split between your professional life and your personal ethics. And I guess I do think that's an important conversation. There's a lot of moral psychology going on there as well, but I think that independently of that personal morality piece, I think that there is an update that needs to be made to the frameworks of product management, the go-to frameworks of product management, to include integrity, to include ethics. And that is not, it doesn't need to be a constraint on growth.
Yeah.
Integrity is not a really high standard. Integrity is not asking you to become social business. It's not even asking you necessarily to become an environmentally sustainable business. That would be great. But I think the baseline level, which I'm asking product teams to include, is this integrity layer. And what is integrity? Integrity is your actions and your goals following your values in a consistent and coherent way and kind of a conscious way. And it's also taking responsibility for your consequences as well, so, and your duties. So it's quite a limited version of ethics, which I'm kind of trying to bring forward in this type of conversation at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's the right approach though, because ultimately, you know, as you said, people have, particularly founders, they've got a million things to think about and worry about. Always top of their mind is going to be growth.
Yeah.
Whether that is revenue growth or user growth to justify, or sorry, to bring in more investment. So I suppose you have to simplify it. And as you said, you can't say, well, it's either you go 100% or nothing. So you can just ask a couple of the right questions.
You can have desirability of your product, whilst through you have desirability through the enabler and constraint of technology viability. Like each of these parts of the frame are enabling, constraining each other. And I think if you are calling yourself a product leader, then you're probably looking for the right kind of growth, a kind of sustainable long-term growth, maybe a slight focus on retention rather than constant acquisition. And I think that type of more strategic attitude includes an ethical frame.
Yeah, I was going to come on to that actually when you mentioned it. Ultimately it is no. I'm glad that we have great minds think alike, I suppose. That there's a self-interest element of it. You know, obviously it would be great if everybody did this out of the kindness of their heart. But as you said, you know, ultimately, if you are building a more ethical organization, over the long term, you will be more successful.
Yeah, people will want to stay with you. Employees will want to stay with you.
And as you said, people are becoming more aware of these questions. So they are, when they pick up a product, saying, does this align with my values? You know, what consequences might be hidden behind the proposed value proposition, for example. But I suppose also it's hard to get people to be strategic and think long term all the time.
This is really like a deep work practice. Like nothing more than ethics requires taking a step back. It's quite to do ethics properly. I should have said at the beginning of this call that I'm an innovation person, but my background's in philosophy. So this is where I'm kind of in ethics, and this is where I'm coming from in this conversation. I think that there's a very intuitive side to ethics. There's to morality, I suppose. There's that. You, as a product leader, you kind of need to make space to listen to your intuitions about stuff. Is this decision that you're making for your product, is it right? What's your gut telling you? But then you need to go a bit beyond that, because often what often happens with ethical conversations, we just find arguments to justify our first ethical intuition. So listen to there's an intuitive aspect, but there's also a kind of frameworked, more cognitive aspect, which is making those conversations around ethics possible in your team. Ideally, this kind of diverse team with different skill sets and coming from different backgrounds and just different ways of thinking, and I think together as a product leader, you should be making these kind of conversations possible. About the decisions we're making in our products ethical.
Let's talk about that, because I mean, when we talk about philosophy and topics like ethics, a lot of people switch off because it seems very high level. It seems very, up and up ivory tower, talking about this and not acting upon it. So how can, what can product leaders do about it? How can they bring in ethics to their process?
Yeah, so I think first off, I think ethics should be very practical and hands-on. It's about how you work with the topic that you're in. It's about making good decisions, right action based on your values. And I think there is this very lofty philosophical side to ethics. And I think that's really brilliant because it sets the agenda and it opens I've forgotten the Gideon's window. It opens, I think that work that philosophers are doing is opening up the possibility for debate. It's opening up the area, the space in which we talk, which is really great. I also think that often ethics is, particularly in this space, is directed towards AI and emerging technologies, which I also think is great. And I think that doesn't disclude the ability to do ethics on much more hands-on business design and technology decisions, which is why I really see this as a product manager's job, because they are responsible for the technology, for the business, for the design of their bit of the product. And I think as long as ethical dialogue remains on that kind of consciousness, really interesting, love that topic, but not super useful for product managers. So well, your question was like how product managers can, what was the question?
How do you make this concrete? How does a product manager or a product leader integrate this into, as you said, I know you have that concept of these 4 sort of quadrants. Maybe talk about that.
It's very easy for me to. It's very easy for me to say, just add integrity to that model and it's done. It really is. It's more than that. So what I've done and I think the article that I wrote, which started off our conversation on this, was try to put this model together where you could analyze what integrity. It's really just a set of prompts of questions where just drawing on the thousands of years of just moral philosophy, but putting that in a nice framework, which was first to ask, what are the affordances of your product? So the affordances is what your product makes possible in the world. And I think sometimes when people talk about ethics, they just jump directly onto the ethics of the tech, the ethics of the design, etc. But I think you need this. The first question you should be asking is, what does your product make possible? Have the groundwork for conversations around ethics. And that's probably going to look very similar to your value proposition, to be honest. But it probably is a bit broader than your value proposition. I saw on LinkedIn this morning you'd like something, which was something from Microsoft, some productivity tracker. You not liked it.
Let's talk about that. I unliked it.
I will go through the model, and I think that example which I just saw on your LinkedIn this morning is a good one to go through the model.
Yeah, excellent.
There was this productivity tracker from Microsoft. I just glanced at the story, but I've got a feeling for what it's about. So the tools that Microsoft are making possible makes it possible that managers can track the usage of the different Microsoft 360 suite tools. Now, their value proposition, as they say in the article, is no, this is for IT managers to be able to understand the value of their IT or something like that. So that's the value proposition, but the affordance is that it makes it possible for managers to track productivity, so-called, on Microsoft tools defined by Microsoft. So there's 6 layers I'm saying to this ethical stack. And I think that all products have an ethical stack, no matter how boring the product is. So I think it's probably better if I just say those layers quickly. So it's affordances, it's duties, values, consequences, stakeholders, and moral situations. And just to really quickly use that example, Microsoft makes it possible for managers to track the productivity of their employees. The duties which are going to be around that are going to be all the different laws around data protection and privacy, but there's probably some duties around human rights and human dignity and the right to privacy and things like that. Then the relevant values are maybe transparency is one of the values which is important. Privacy might be important. Dignity, which of course is all very linked and all interoperable, to use kind of product language.
Yeah.
The consequences layer, that is looking at the real world consequences of those affordances happening in the world. So that could be increase of productivity as a kind of maybe a positive, so-called positive consequence, but it could also maybe be an increase of burnout, etc.
So affordances is possibilities, consequences, a translation of those into reality.
Yeah, so affordances is what is becoming possible in the world. So, a gun makes it possible to shoot someone.
Yeah.
Consequences, people being shot.
Understood.
Yeah.
Sorry, so you said, just to recap that before I jump in again. So affordances, duties, values, No, it's good. So affordances, duties, values, consequences.
Yeah. And then there's stakeholders. So that is, on whom are you having these consequences? And and I think you need to have a really broad concept with stakeholders. So that's not just your users, but that's also your indirect stakeholders. So in the case of I'm thinking this on the spot, but in the case of this productivity tracking tool from Microsoft, you've clearly got a direct stakeholder in the employer, you've got a direct stakeholder in the employee. I'm trying to imagine who those indirect stakeholder. An indirect stakeholder might be the family of the employee who's been burnt out, for example. I think the best example of stakeholders for me, which is really intuitive, is Airbnb. It's this, the host and the guest are direct stakeholders, but the neighbors are indirect stakeholders. Because they're all
a neighborhood even as well.
And the neighborhood, exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, there's situations. So you shouldn't have this static view of morality, of ethics. It's constantly changing. Like, if you don't normally have a duty to look after someone else's kid, but if you were walking past a lake and you saw a kid drowning in the lake, you suddenly have a duty to help that child because you're put in an immoral situation. And for example, COVID made many product teams had to somehow react to COVID. Tinder had to tell users to not meet in person, you're completely going against this value proposition because it was put in a new moral situation. So that's the kind of the final layer of this stack. And I think this kind of tool, this kind of thinking just allows, I see this as a way of researching ethics and analyzing ethics. I see it as a way of structuring conversations. And I think that's super important to make ethical conversations safe, is to bring kind of structure. And if you kind of do that analysis, and I think in some of my articles, I've got examples of that analysis, you can kind of see where integrity is missing. Yeah. And if you've got an indirect stakeholder which is being ignored, or you've got a duty, or let's say you've got this kind of value around care which is within your business, in your team, even you can research what values your users want from you as well. Let's say you've got a value of privacy, I mean, let's say Microsoft had a value of privacy, and then it's exposing employees' productivity data to employers. There's something wrong from an integrity perspective there if there's not opt-in. There needs to be some kind of product requirement coming out of that to have integrity, which is we allow users to opt in to giving this information. And that's an example for me of how you would go from this kind of analysis to a product ethics requirement, which would look very similar to a desirability requirement coming out of user research.
No, I love the framework because it is really applicable, and I think it highlights, actually, in a way, it's not just about ethics. It's about is this plan or is this strategy a long-term strategy?
Yeah,
but that's really what you're asking, actually, or at least that's the consequence of.
I think
of doing this.
Is it in keeping with our purpose? Is it in keeping with our values? It's sharper. The background of ethics is that it comes from Greek, ancient Greek conversations around how to be a leader.
Interesting. Well, exactly. I mean, they talk about this, Stoicism is one of those schools where it is taking, or Greek philosophy generally, right? The role of philosophy was not to be this ivory tower thing, and it's highly theoretical, but actually, how do we think about things and translate them into concrete action, thought and action? Which I really like this framework because it is very actionable. I mean, just to wrap up, actually, I mean, one thing I would love to. I could have this conversation for hours.
I can talk about this all day.
One thing that we're doing at the product, one decision that I've made is, I really don't believe technology does enough good in the world. Like, obviously, there are some really great tools. For example, I went at the barber in Brazil, just at the favela near where we're staying. Pop in, like, really nice chat, like really Brazilian. I just talking to, like, there's a kid there, and me and the barber talking to him. And I was like, it's amazing. You have this poor black kid from the favela who's learning English through Duolingo on their phone to the point that we were speaking Portuguese. But you go, wow, even 10 years ago, this kid would, that's his way out. He actually just, keeps using that app because there's such a lack of English speakers in Brazil. He's going to get a good job, and he's out of the favela. He's lifted out of poverty. Like, that's amazing. But on the other side, look at Amazon, right? There's not being enough done, and I think a lot of the time it's about not translating things or not knowing what to do. You speak to people who work at Google, Facebook, like, they're good people, right? I think they're people that if you meet them, you'd go, they're not working for an evil corporation. I think people just don't know how to translate this into action. So one thing that we're going to be doing from January is something I'm going to call the 10% pledge, where 10% of profits goes to specific reforestation projects that we're looking at. And I would love, what I'm really interested in doing is, firstly, I want to do that because I feel that I'm personally not doing enough. And I think that companies should lead there and show that, you don't have to work for a charity to do something good. Second thing, that I'd love to measure the impact of saying, for example, did we see an increase in sales from adding this pledge? Or, for example, of those people that looked at the page, the 10% pledge, do we see a higher rate, or do we see them triggered into making a sale? Because then we're basically showing, okay, you can feel good and do good things whilst reaping the benefits of it. And I think the more cases you get of that, the more, as we're saying with sustainability, right, you're starting to see this snowball effect, because it is a point of massive weakness if you're the only company that's not using recycled packaging, etc.
I think that's really great what you're doing there. I think it might not translate to sales.
That may not.
And it will still be great. It's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Independently of it translating to sales. I think from this kind of product ethics perspective, I would also look for ways of bringing ethics intrinsically into your value proposition. So, what you do is you train product leaders, you bring the mental models to product leaders. So I think the place where you can have the most impact intrinsically is actually by promoting an ethical kind of product leadership, as is with your platform.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a great point, rather than an add-on on the
plus mitigating damage, plus doing good for the world through the trees. I can't remember how you called it.
Reforestation.
The 10% pledge. It's absolutely brilliant, but also your biggest responsibility as a product ethics lead trainer is, I think, bringing ethics to product leadership.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think actually that's. Yeah, again, it's interesting because I find that I'm falling foul of the same things we've talked about. It's like you think about this. I try and teach morality threaded throughout the training program, but there's no explicit. Here's how to think about ethics. But now I have a nice framework that I can bring in. James, it's been been a pleasure. I've learned a lot. I love the model. I think it is really actionable. You demonstrated that you can actually apply it to any situation. You talked about this sort of 6 questions to ask around affordances, duties, values, consequences, stakeholders, and the moral situation. And I think this is an area that is going to be more and more relevant, more and more important, and I looking forward to seeing you actually being one of the leaders at the forefront of this as well.
Thank you so much, Henry. It was lovely to speak to you.
No worries. Anywhere we should send people? Maybe we send them to that article.
I think there's an article. If you follow me on Medium, James Lynden, I've done an article on this. I think my thinking's developing on this as well, and I'm planning to. I just bought a URL yesterday.
Very nice.
To the productethicscanvas.com. So I think watch that space there, and I'm hoping to just make these tools available online very soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much, James. It's been a pleasure as always.